Despite many's best efforts, world-building and narrative are often two separate genres in fiction. A good story should and tends to focus on just that, the story. World-building is important to literally build the world the story happens in, if it's not real life on Earth, of course. But the crux and enjoyment of many world-building settings is also just that, building a world. So it can be a frustration to many if they want to try and include more in their world building. But how does one go about that and make it feel relevant and organic? Creatures are one of the most popular facets of world building. And in recent years there's been a suite of creatures that, without still just being stand-ins for humans with a different appearance, would still be counted as characters. So let's take a look at some of them, how they're done, and what makes them work. Obviously, the big thing holding many pure creature characters back from an advanced storyline is a lack of dialogue. Once they can talk, they instantly become much more of a human stand-in, even if their bestial traits aren't necessarily forgotten by the narrative. So, one of the best characters comes from an IP where everyone is non-verbal, even the hominid character. This of course being Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal. A common theme with many creature characters is that they do tend to have a human to bounce off, and sometimes they can partly fill in the gaps. And Spear does still fulfill this role, albeit in his own non-verbal way. Naturally, the bond between man and beast is one seen in many people's lives, and is replicated in our own pets. As such, many creatures will draw heavily from domestic pets and especially dogs and cats. Tartakovsky puts a lot of his own dogs in Fang, and believes that micro-gestures and changes in body posture can convey a lot in an animal, describing it as that you always know how your dog is feeling, which many pet owners would probably agree with. He also admits a lot of such assumptions are heavily inferred anyway, but it doesn't hold back his creations. Animals do have distinct personalities, both in a more technical term of differences in shyness and boldness, and then the resultant experiences, and the more anthropomorphized term of personalities like our own. And Tartakovsky is still careful to never humanize Fang too much in the episodes. A lot of it is just grunts and nods, in gestures that are still small, and taken from other animals over anything a person would do. So personality is sorted. But for Fang's joint journey and development in the series, it's all dependent on her interactions with Spear. And I do think how this was steadily built up episode by episode is a really solid case of visual storytelling through its characters. After they meet in episode 1, all of episode 2 is spent fighting. As the two heads of their respective families used to being in charge, they both try to assert dominance over each other. Only when they're relatively evenly matched and need each other to get out of a snake flood is some conclusion reached. But just because they're not trying to kill each other in episode 3 doesn't mean that they're working together very well. The opening fight against the old mammoth shows both of them getting their asses handed to them, as they each individually try to take down the mammoth and lose. Only when, mainly by accident, they attack together do they take it down. Fang then ignores Spear's generous but unnecessary attempts to keep her warm, and Spear winds up having to drag their supplies himself despite being far smaller. There's no way around it. As a team, they're in absolute shambles, and they only survive the rest of the herd by giving the tusk back. So then episode 4 presents something of an acid test for the relationship. Both are given an opportunity when in danger that they could just run, but instead choose to go back and save the other, when Fang is being carried off by the bats, and when, well, the same happens to Spear. Obviously, Spear is the more cognitively developed of the two, and so his choice scene is much shorter. Of course, he's aware that he needs Fang. Fang's is the far longer scene to truly send home the message that they're a pair now. Following this, the only way they escape the insurmountable danger of the bats is Fang trusting Spear on something one of her micro-gestures very clearly shows she thinks is a bad move. But she goes along with it anyway, and as a result they survive. The emotional crux of this development comes in the mid-season finale, as Fang is almost killed by the ape men and Spear has to both rescue her and then nurse her back to health. From this point on, it's clear the two are now in full synergy. By episode 10, The two are still the strong yet occasionally bumbling personalities they started off as, but when things get serious they can fluidly leap into action as a single well-oiled machine. When Mira is kidnapped, they go from asleep to obliterating ape men in about 2 seconds. So the stories become much less about the building of the established relationship, but changing the foes to be essentially unwinnable enemies that explore this newly built partnership. When Spear has a nightmare about the effects of the plague of madness, he doesn't just dream about himself getting bitten, but sees Fang similarly getting mauled by the sauropod. Again with the Coven of Witches, Fang is captured and used as the mount, whereas Spear is left conscious. But of course, Primal is an animated series, and whilst it'd be wrong to say it's childish, it does use its animation to get away with a lot more that you couldn't do in a live action, or something generally more keen to resemble real life. One of the biggest things to try and avoid when making creature characters is of course anthropomorphization, making them too human in either emotion or motivation. Whilst Fang can occasionally be too smart for a dinosaur, as said, Primal gets away with a lot of it under the blanket of animation. It is, after all, a show about a caveman riding a dinosaur. But even then it never pushes it. Fang clearly feels stress and anger over the death of her offspring, but never cries. She doesn't have a sense of humour and so never laughs. And whilst the other dinosaurs and creatures can often be antagonistic, they're never evil unless they reach hominid levels. For the complete opposite and how not to write creature characters, the Jurassic World franchise is of course right there. In a more straight-laced animation, David Armsby's Dinosauria succeeds excellently at well-designed recreations of dinosaurs with speculative behaviours and then setting them as established characters too. The series and Armsby in general succeeds amazingly at show don't tell, with micro-gestures, shot composition and body language, telling you all you need to know about what the animals and characters are thinking. Armsby's are probably the most purely animalistic from these examples, with some of the personality coming from the fact they're the only example of their kind in the video. The Troodon is established as a cunning and resourceful mother, but it's not like it has to stand out from a ton of other small feathered Maniraptorians. This is absolutely not a detraction though, but just smart planning from the creator. Armsby is also careful too to avoid anthropomorphization. In one scene that's a fruit so low-hanging it may as well be growing out of the ground, the character Hadrosaur confronts the Tyrannosaur that killed its mate over the Tyrannosaur's nest. It simply brushes past it to follow the call of another of its own kind, and then runs past the bones of its mate. A lesser creator would have tried to force a showdown, or had the Hadrosaur trample the Tyrannosaur's eggs, or had the Hadrosaur react to the bones of its mate like an elephant might, in a speculation that's likely too far a reach for a less cognitively advanced dinosaur. Rather, the emotions are underplayed for a more successful and more animalistic payoff, with the Hadrosaur just finding a new mate as most animals would try to do. Anthropomorphization and creature characters straddle a fine line when you get into primate characters though. On one hand, they do provide a luxury in that you can do a lot more with them. The greater challenge then comes in not just writing them as non-verbal humans, and including enough animal. Andy Serkis watched mounting gorillas in both the wild and captivity for his performance as Kong. And Jackson's Kong was generally the most animalistic and a literal interpretation of a 25-foot gorilla. The original King Kong was more overtly monstrous, with much less consent and bond with Anne, and her multiple kidnappings. The MonsterVerse's Kong is arguably the most human, going out of his way to help the innocent, having a shower, and he can generally be communicated with and reasoned with to some degree. No one would try to reason with the original Kong, and Jackson's Kong only had his tragedy increased by the fact it's clear he can never really quite pick up on Anne's sincerity after she accepts him. His quest to find company again never really did succeed properly, even if they still have an established bond. Kong's occasional counterpart Godzilla has some well-known rules regarding his characterization, one being that he's apparently not allowed to show too much emotion. Wingard somewhat famously ignored this in Godzilla vs. Kong, which is a pity as MonsterVerse Goji is really at his best when indifferent, both as a force and a character. Wingard's half of the monsterverse has Godzilla generally committing consequence-free destruction, and this is treated as something we should seemingly all be grateful for. In the first half, Godzilla is generally depicted as still destructive, but the lesser of two evils. In G14, he only really destroys things when chasing the Mutos into populated areas. And in King of the Monsters, it's obviously depicted that he's the better option to throw your lot in with than the more destructive Ghidorah. In two moments where the opposing kaiju get close-up scenes with humans, Ghidorah chooses to actively annihilate despite no threat to him. This malevolence isn't countered with benevolence from Goji, but rather just indifference. As Serizawa comes to detonate the nuke to restore Godzilla, there's no wink or shed tear or any real reaction whatsoever. The feelings are one-sided, and the scene really is a transaction at its core. We give you a nuke, you sort out Ghidorah. Because rather than ever trying to prove Mark wrong, to its credit the film only really shows Godzilla as a better alternative, that it's worthwhile to keep around rather than actually good. In their initial Antarctic skirmish, Godzilla does almost flatten the protagonist himself. It's clear he's not really looking out for anyone but Big G. Not all big lizards are so callous though. Following Season 2, say what you will about its validity as an adaptation, and there is a lot to say there, or indeed its general writing, or consistency of characters, or maybe it's just best to say that if nothing else, House of the Dragon does indeed succeed on delivering on its titular dragons, both in general visual effects and forming them as distinct characters. And both of these flow directly into one another. With the creativity of the shots and their close association with their riders, the dragons as specific individuals actually have a much greater importance to their story than they ever did in Game of Thrones. When we see the near kaiju-sized silhouette of Vhagar towering over the battlements of Storm's End, we know Lucaris is in a lot of trouble, and that Aemond, her rider, has beat him to the negotiating table with Lord Boros. When we hear the high whistling of Caraxes above the battlefield in the Stepstones, we know Daemon is momentarily about to bring fire and blood to proceedings. All of this is only possible when the dragons are so well established as different from one another. So much of their visual design also just speaks for itself, and again can speak for the owners too. In a tiny detail probably impossible to see on screen, Syrax has a carving of an old Valyrian poem in her horn, like the stereotype of teenage first lovers carving their initials through a heart in the bark of a tree. So Syrax has those connotations of adolescent romance that Rhaenyra goes through pre-timeskip in Season 1. And the owner comparison gets even stronger in Season 2, when Syrax essentially does nothing for all 8 episodes. Arax is translucent white. He looks very new, almost unfinished. He simply hasn't lived long enough to look weathered yet. He's the youngest dragon, and he's very small and nervous. Just like his fresh-faced rider Lucaris, the hapless millhouse of Westeros. In the final chase above Storm's End, tiny Arax has to do so much flying just to stay aloft in the winds, whereas the monumental Vhagar glides through the gale force with barely a beat of her wings. Much of this personality is also transferred into their custom animations too. Vhagar's ease doesn't just come from size, but age and experience too. Having optimized her movements, she only does the bare minimum for the maximum reward. One of her briefing points was that she should be majestic in the air. Rules were set for the dragons too, and Vhagar's head was never allowed to rise above her shoulders, to give her a permanent hunchback like an elderly person. The costs of being Vhagar is that takeoff is difficult for her in old age, and she was based on both real albatrosses and the animated one from the Rescuers Down Under when taking off. Again, there are some parallels with domestic animals to use their familiarity to tell us more about how a non-human character may be feeling. Caraxes is like a rabid dog, twitchy and snappy and unstable. He's only really comfortable around Daemon, and the two are both restless and abrasive to be around. Again, some interpretation from people comes into this too, both the actors and the fanbase. Sunfire is generally viewed as an innocent golden retriever good boy, which perhaps may not hold up with time. But Aegon's actor Tom Glencarny read a lot of his dog in their beloved playful head bump moment.
Oh, I feel very protective over Sunfire. I mean, you've just been saying you've been playing with Ziggy, my dog.
Yeah.
And I feel like Sunfire is an extension of him. There was that nice scene where we see Aegon and Sunfire kind of meet, and that kind of little nudge that Sunfire gives him in the chest. All I was seeing there was Ziggy. It's great to see that sort of creature, that beast, come to life.
Which isn't wrong for the character. Canonically, the two share a very strong bond. Some even interpret Sunfire's turn in their fall, a deliberate move to protect Aegon. Vhagar, when not being used to commit a war crime by Aemond.
I mean, he's a broken boy, he just needs someone to fix him.
Exactly.
Is almost always sleeping. Close to 200, she's compared to a grumpy old cat, and tries roasting anyone who wakes her. When told to stand down before battle, she has a sigh just like an old dog sitting down.
On boss, Vhagar, Sir Daor.
And it's suggested that getting up and moving is an uncomfortable affair for one so old. Overall, the effort put in to depict Vhagar as simultaneously huge, old and powerful pays off immensely by giving her a distinct character and appearance, unlike many other dragons. Her age gifts her the size, but rather than just raw strength coming from size, it comes with the burden of her awkwardness under gravity. Parts of her have sloughed and chipped off, she's starting to atrophy, her skin sags. It's a perfect portrait of telling you who she is in a look. Such nuances are in her character too. As her rider of the time, Laena, dies in a miscarriage, like an upset animal, Vhagar whinnies and shakes her head. Empathetic to her rider's pain, and confused by the demand of self-destruction. Only when she seems to realise it as mercy over murder, does she relent and give Laena the end she wants. I think a lot of this also comes from the fact House of the Dragon is adapted from a world-building project over a narrative project, drawn chiefly from The World of Ice and Fire, which is literally the universe's world-building book, as well as Fire and Blood and the short story The Princess and the Queen, all made to flesh out the world of Westeros and Essos, the history of House Targaryen, and the civil strife known as the Dance of the Dragons. And it's in Vhagar that all of this comes into play, as the series' oldest dragon. Not just that, but she's the largest, oldest, and most powerful living thing in the known world, being 181 at the time of the dance, and all the feats of her life are recorded in such books. She's literally from a different age, and was directly involved in forming the history of the continent, being a dragon of the conquest, the surviving dragon of the conquest, that saw action in influential battles like the Field of Fire and the Dragon's Wrath on Dawn. She lit the pyre of the Conqueror himself, and is living history, a sentient Kittiwake or Concord, or perhaps Fat Man or Little Boy. Much of this comes into play in her scenes in Rook's Rest especially, and how other people react to seeing her.
We must get you to cover, my lord.
Seeing any adult dragon is an event, but most people will have been lucky enough to see one in their life. Seeing Vhagar is something else entirely. The entire battlefield halts. Even Lord Stanton himself can't look away when seeing the Queen of all Dragons approach, to literally besiege his tiny keep. You don't look away from such an event. even if this living history will be your end. And against Vhagar, you never really stood much of a chance anyway. Vhagar simply carries so much gravitas in the world, all eyes are on her. And all this weight and reaction in-universe only comes from her history in Gurm's extensive world building. The things her character has done. And will do. When the dragons do dance again, the battlefield can only watch below as for the second time in their history, the dragons actually have a proper dogfight. This is literal history in the making. And the people only turn and run when they get close enough to crush them. Vhagar also carries the general theme of Gurm's dragons too. The shots of her lumbering through the ashes of dragon battle, crushing her own side's men in the scramble to take off and kill Meleys, is a fantastic moment calling back to the fact dragons were meant to be weapons, and ones you're maybe not entirely meant to support. Gurm has said they're essentially nuke stand-ins, and there's one quote from Barristan about how fire only destroys, and dragons are fire-made flesh. The fallout from Rook's Rest, both in episode and after through Kristen's character, is also generally some of the best remaining writing in the show. His weird, spacey apathy to everything, as he realises that his own fate and most other people's will now be decided on Dragonback, and that even if they're victorious, said victory can still destroy much of your own forces, no matter how powerful. Of course, a lot of this will only reach maximum emphasis if you either read the books or watch the YouTube explained recaps of someone who has. And I think to some level, the best world builders and character designers will have to come to terms with the fact that, if lucky enough to be designing for the masses in film and TV, a lot of the extra info may never be seen and the detail never understood. Or at least not by those who don't nerd out on the special features and making of in the DVDs. Again, the era of the YouTuber has really come into its own to spread that info to broader audiences. The V-Rexes of Skull Island were envisioned as a family of ornery rednecks, the adults being related and the juvenile being their offspring. Each one was given a distinct look and personality that somewhat corresponds to their fate in the fight. The playful puppy dog juvenile is obviously the first taken down, due to being the worst combatant. The bull in his prime was taken out in the vines, due to being the most significant threat. In the commentary, Jackson mentions he and Kong have tangled numerous times before, with some of Kong's wounds coming from the bull. But many likely wouldn't know this, though some points can be inferred through visual design, like the matriarch's age through her sagging skin and low-slung body. Most of it is only really if you look it up in the special features. The World of Kong book was a luxury for the Weta Workshop, with Daniel Falconer mentioning that sort of creative effort essentially went into every project, and so much of it ultimately remains unseen. The book was a rare opportunity for such creators to actually get to show it all off. Much of the examples given come from more fantastical sources, and for the more straight-laced world builder interested in more factual breakdowns, one may assume they're doomed to deal in mere scientific description and figures, when this isn't necessarily the case. Real life is filled with cases of individual animals that can be described as characters themselves, having noteworthy lives remembered after they're gone that go on to inform public perception of their species. Pick any man-eating big cat or cattle-raiding wolf, with both getting formal scientific attention as well as popular culture surrounding them. Or nowadays, habituated animals in tourist zones, that as well as posing for tourist photographs, can often be animals repeatedly filmed for documentaries, serving as ambassadors for their species to an audience of millions. Such records go back ages, and to many species too. The true historical story of Porphyrios the belligerent whale, in his never-ending quest to dunk on Emperor Justinian and his ships, is a very early example. The simple fact is, animal personality is recognised as a legitimate thing, and anyone who works in reasonably close contact with wild animals, not just domestic pets, can see it. Contrary to what many believe, scientists can and do too. It's just that zoological science also frowns heavily on anthropomorphization, and so giving too much information to animal characters would rarely make it past peer review. Hence why some occasionally write less formal books about their studies of animals too. Documentary, while still occasionally criticised by many as too anthropomorphised, when focusing on singular animals or groups of them, can also be another way of organically showing off the animal as an individual. Of course, I should hastily add this only really applies to documentaries that are actually good, and honestly shot. As a quick example to break from mammals, Prehistoric Planet does a good job on a micro level with its Triceratops rut scene. The large bull, based on the real Yoshi specimen if he'd reached adulthood, has larger horns than any other bull at the Lek, and decades of experience, using both to win. It establishes the bull as different, explains how, then pays off both within the scene with him winning the fight. A solid bit of quick character work while clearly remaining an animal. And in some cases, the scientific texts many try to replicate also have plenty such examples. F-125, or Savannah, the mountain lion, gets her own boxes in a book, serving as an example of an individual that lived in an atypical habitat for her kind of open grassland. This led to her often taking atypical prey in the form of pronghorn, becoming a specialist in them, and also occasionally losing her kills due to wolves and bears that frequent open areas, giving an example of why mountain lions often avoid such areas, but also only proving Savannah's tenacity in her ability to survive and rear cubs there. It's contrasted with another mountain lion, who lived a more typical mountain lion life in a more forested habitat, but had far less success. Another specialist mountain lion got a whole paper to itself, as it also served as a jumping-off point to discuss certain aspects in either animal behaviour or mountain lion biology. Exceptional individuals of any form, be they diet, habitat, fecundity, or any other aspect of behaviour, ecology, or physiology, and all those three likely flow into each other as well, will always be of scientific interest, and can be used to illustrate broader topics in their species or record interesting deviation. Similarly, in studies where ecology or behaviour are prevalent, a case study will provide a closer look into a single individual, or group of individuals, to go for a deep dive of typical examples of common behaviours, using them to provide close detail. And again, this can be in any behavioural or ecological topic you wish. Max Brooks's Devolution provides perhaps an example of some of the most animalistic creatures, whose characters were directly inspired not by film, TV or pets, but by scientific study. The troop of starving Sasquatches within borrow a lot in general from primatology, with Brooks's habit of extensively researching his novels, but are most obviously meant to be reminiscent of Jane Goodall's initial publications on chimpanzees. They're all individual characters, and named by the protagonist Kate, for appearance or perceived role in the group, just as the troops at Gombe were. And the Greenloop troop are probably based most heavily on chimpanzees, and especially Gombe chimps and their actions and personalities in their behaviour for the events of the novel. So it's often up to the creator as to how much they want to lean into a narrative aspect, how much time they want to devote to it, and what tone they want to do it in. But overall, it's very clear no matter what form your world takes, there is plenty of room for creature characters, even in more straight-laced ones too. Thanks for watching, and thanks to top patron Toxic Wolf, as well as the Superest Duper, Samburgo, K. Sandom, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, nickname 3110, Erin Garsteiny, Kieran McCarthy, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, Dapperaptor, Bonecrusher Hyena, original username, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Zesa, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakuhatsu Bakumatsu, for helping to keep the channel going with their generosity. There's a link in the description if you'd like to join up, and any amount is always appreciated. This was an atypical video, I know, but I had some natterings on House of the Dragon I wanted to expunge, as well as some leftover natterings from Primal 2 I felt I could have delved more into. Part of this also came from talking about such things with Sawyer 2, subscribe to his channel, and the general clash between narrative and world building many face. So who worse than me to wade into such things? Anyways, next time we'll be back to Monster Hunter, and back to species profiles as well. for a patron-funded episode to kick things off. Hopefully I'll see you there for it.